This is Mind Your Business, and I'm your host, Bob Burnett. I'm a Bitcoin evangelist, the former chief technology officer for the PC company Gateway, and the founder of Barefoot Mining. On Mind Your Business, I have conversations with the brightest and most innovative people across the Bitcoin ecosystem, and we explore and contrast the different perspectives on Bitcoin, economics, business, and life. Today, I welcome Eric Yakes. Eric is the author of the book, The Seventh Property, Bitcoin and the Monetary Revolution. Eric has a deep knowledge of money, monetary history, and a deep passion for Bitcoin that make his voice one that commands attention. Let's drop in now on my conversation with Eric. Eric, welcome to Mind Your Business. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me on, Bob.
Well, I got a chance, for those of you listening, I got a chance to meet Eric in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. We both were speakers at a Bitcoin Day event. There was still cold there, wasn't it? I don't remember.
It was a little chilly. Daytime wasn't too bad, but yeah, it was pretty windy when we were out there.
So, well, from a guy that lives in Naples, Florida, it was chilly. So even though I used to live just south of there, and our business is our main business for Barefoot Mining is just south of there. But anyway, Eric and I got a chance to meet there. I got to have dinner with Eric and another group of, kind of hardcore Bitcoiners. And I really enjoyed that conversation, Eric. After doing that, I got a chance to read your book, which we'll talk about here quite a bit. But, I think that I want to start to tell people, I'll hold it up here. This book right here, The Seventh Property, Bitcoin and the Monetary Revolution, is Eric's labor of love. And I have read it cover to cover. It's an outstanding book. Whether you're an experienced Bitcoiner or you're somebody kind of new to the space, I think you'll find it highly, highly educational and highly entertaining. So we'll talk about the book more, but it's a must read if you're anywhere even remotely close to the Bitcoin space.
I appreciate that, Bob.
So to start with, Eric, tell me, where did you grow up? What type of childhood you have? What were you?
I jump at all of it. So I grew up in Denver, Colorado, and my childhood I was raised very Catholic, went to Catholic boys school, all of that. And I was really into sports. That was kind of what I did when I was younger. That's what I was really focused on in high school. And, I didn't really start maturing until I went off to college in a lot of ways. I wasn't very focused on school when I was younger. But it was right around when I was going to college. I was like, all right, man, you need to start figuring out what you want to do in life. And, I really quickly, I was drawn to economics. My dad gave me the book Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman when I was 18. And, I didn't do a lot of, I don't think I ever read a book just for the fun of it when I was in high school. And then that was kind of the first book that I was just totally drawn into. And, I went off to college and I was just thinking about careers and, I didn't really have any perspective on the world yet. And well, I took some personality tests and those told me like investment banking or management consulting, those would be good areas for you to go into. And I kind of researched into them and I was like, yeah, this sounds pretty interesting to me. And then I started putting together a plan and that ultimately, I ended up I wanted to work in private equity. So I put together this plan and, I'm double majored in finance and economics in undergrad. And I turned it around quite a bit in college. I was very serious. I was very focused on school. I was also, I like to, this is kind of an interesting piece that just occurred to me on this conversation. I never really talked about this on a podcast before, but so when I was in college, I was part of an underground fraternity for a period. And it was very much like this kind of rebellious organization against the school. And what I really liked about it is, our school was laying down all these hardline rules. Nothing ever bad happened in our fraternity. It was just like accumulation of minor infractions. And eventually they said, oh, we're suspending you from campus for X amount of years. So we kept the thing going. And we're just like, no, this is a good thing that we have. We're, bringing a group of guys together who are all very motivated, all very intelligent. We like to enjoy ourselves and enjoy college, but, we like to do what we want to do and you can't stop us from socially organizing. And, and I was actually president of that fraternity. And that was probably, I did all these internships so that I could eventually get the job I went out of college. But I think probably the best experience that I got in terms of, running an organization and leadership was when I was president of that. And I think that I kind of always had this a bit of a rebellious spark. I didn't like the way that certain organizations in the world operated, what they wanted people to do, and how they wanted them to toe the line in certain ways. And that definitely came through in the way that we were acting in college. And I really really enjoyed it because I knew that what we were doing is good. And that was one of the big things that kind of always you know, in hindsight, with what I'm doing now and how I'm involved in the Bitcoin space, I think a lot of it's a product of, understanding what the reality of the world is and, living life in accordance with a set of values, but not just necessarily submitting to organizations because they're in some sort of position and authority, and that there's ways that you can still do things. And yeah, so that was probably my favorite experience in college. And then, I graduated. The first job that I got was in corporate restructuring. I worked for a firm called FTI Consulting, and that was in kind of this. We were a niche area of management consulting. We weren't like a full-scale investment banking firm. We had our subdivision that did do investment banking when necessary. But restructuring guys, we are, we get brought into businesses when they're in troubled scenarios, and we can help them either, cost cut or turn their operations around or come up with some sort of strategy to do that. And then there's also the investment banking side of a lot of that, where you have to determine, well, we need financing to make, X, Y, and Z occur within the organization. We have to have knowledge of the bankruptcy process in order to do that. And we ultimately, have to determine what assets are liquid, what can be sold off to generate the amount of liquidity we need to, get through this troubled scenario. And that's the general nature of what we were doing. But when I was there, we weren't going through much of a restructuring cycle. So I was around, I was there from, what was that, 2015 to 2017, and very beginning of 2018. And I ended up doing a lot of due diligence because companies were healthier. The companies we're dealing with were typically much more mature businesses that were towards, maybe the latter portion of the industry life cycle that they were in. And a lot of our clients were private equity firms. So private equity firms would hire us to do due diligence on transactions for them. And that was what I got very proficient at. And I was just like a big Excel model guy. And I gained those skills, and then eventually I gained enough skills to where I could be competitive in a private equity interview process. And I moved to another firm out in Denver, and it's called Lion Equity Partners. So that was a spinoff of a larger firm called Platinum Equity based out of LA. They have a very interesting story. They were founded by Thomas Gores, and he was him and his brother were immigrants, and they both had these two very large private equity funds, Platinum Equity and then Gores Group out in LA. And Thomas Gores is now the owner of the Detroit Pistons, and that's largely because he set up a very successful private equity fund. So they specialized. There was a niche that wasn't being attacked back when he was setting this up in the corporate carve-out industry. So when a larger enterprise is divesting a division of itself, there's a lot of complications that come if you're a buyer of that. Now, it might be easy if you're a strategic buyer like another company sometimes, but the integrations of moving a piece of the pie in with another company gets nasty because it doesn't have a back office. The accounting gets very difficult. And, having a private equity buyer who does these, full time and understands exactly what to look for, exactly what's necessary, they can bid a lot higher because they know what they're doing. That was a really strong niche for them to get into. And eventually, Platinum grew to be so big that, they were only doing, upper middle market to mega deals. And that kind of left a void in the lower to middle market. And that's what my fund did. Is there's a few different funds that spun off of Platinum, and they went after the middle market. So we were out in Denver. We were doing the corporate carve outs. Typically, we're buying divisions of companies that have some sort of major issue. They might be declining in some sort of way. And, I was there for about a year and a half. And, all the while when I was doing this, I was thinking about Bitcoin. And, my journey with Bitcoin started in 2015. And that was around my senior.
Can I stop you right there?
Go
Eric?
ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Because before we get into the Bitcoin part, I have a couple questions for you, actually kind of zooming back a little bit. So I appreciate you sharing so much of your history. I found the comments about the underground fraternity to be fascinating.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that. I think there's a, rebellious is probably the wrong word, but
It's a bit for sure.
something on that, but it's just fascinating that I think all of us in the Bitcoin world um, relate to.
Hmm.
There's a second thing that strikes me. This is a very small sample size. By the way, you're the fourth guest on this podcast.
Okay.
But um, at least in two of the other interviews, one with James Lavish and one with Steve Barber, James just came short of playing in the NHL. Steve Barber was a baseball player, played at a pretty high level, even until very recently. I have a lot of athletic endeavors in my past, and you also mentioned, being very sports focused, and just like you said, you had kind of an epiphany, maybe a little bit about that relationship to the underground fraternity. Another one is kind of occurring to me here about sports, and it relates to I happened to at Bitcoin 2022 this year, I had a chance to go watch Robert Breedlove interview Jordan Peterson, and it was kind of a little private thing that was occurring there, and so I'm a little bit outside of my space, so I'm going to do my best to do justice to this. But one of the things that Jordan Peterson talked about was that Piaget, who was a a guru, godfather of child psychology, said that one of the things you learn about children very early on is that children like to play games in which the rules are known and they're fair. And that's what people find fun. It's not really the winning or the losing necessarily. It's that, you have a defined set of rules and you play within those rules and you win or you lose. And you can't play a baseball game where when it comes to the bottom of the ninth inning and you make the third out against the opponent, and then the opponent says, well, actually, I'm going to get 4 outs now. I didn't lose. I get 4 outs. No, I get 5 outs. No, you can't do that. If that happens, at some point, the children will quickly say, I don't want to play this game anymore. And they disassociate. They disassociate with the game and they disassociate with the people who are involved. And so one of the things that's maybe striking me is that, are those of us that came through the sports side where, we play these games. It doesn't matter whether it's hockey or baseball or, golf or gymnastics, doesn't matter what, but we have a set of rules. And that's what we're looking for in our monetary system too. And that our belief in Bitcoin often comes from that, like, hey, that's a game I want to play. I know what the rules are. Like I said, I may be off base, but just I'm seeing this trend a little bit, and a lot of other people that I know within the Bitcoin world have either still are or in the past had quite a bit of athletic endeavors in that. So I wonder if there's a propensity for us to gravitate toward this. And
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think on so I played lacrosse growing up, and I played every sport when I was younger, and then I focused on lacrosse in high school. I played it in college too, and yeah, it was it's definitely a personality type. Um, my dad was always really big on you play team sports, you play contact sports when I was growing up, and it's not to discredit other sports, but there's a lot of valuable skills gained from being a part of that. If you compare that to but I guess my dad was focusing more on making sure I was doing well in sports when I was, pretty young than he was on my schoolwork. And a lot of that's because of the life lessons that you learn playing those types of sports. You're put in a position where you're working with an organization of people and you are operating under pressure and you have to make split-second decisions and you have to coordinate and you have to agree, and bad things happen and you have to resolve them and, make sure that no grudges are maintained. Otherwise you might have a pretty bad season. And I think that, one of the interesting things when I was in the fraternity and why I was saying, like, I think it's some of the most valuable skills is, being the leader of an organization like that, when we were kicked off campus, we didn't have any sort of international organization that had any sort of leverage against us. It was
Yeah.
voluntary. People who were a part of what we were doing had to want to be a part of what we were doing, and that was it. There's no penalties. There's no nothing that could occur. And so doing that, it's not only does this organization have to be compelling enough for people who want to stick around, but when you're leading that, you also have to navigate the political sides. And that was one of the key things that I noticed was a distinction. And it took me a while. I just noticed the distinction in the people. And over time, I started to realize a lot of that came down to whether or not these guys played team sports. And there was one side of the fraternity that often would go one direction when we're voting on things. There was another side. And these two sides operated very differently. It's very easy for me to deal with the guys who are more like team oriented. They're much more in your face. They say what's on their mind. They're typically a bit more aggressive, which isn't always helpful. And then on the other side of it, it's a lot, it's a lot more political. And you got guys who say things behind each other's backs. They won't really confront you as much. They're afraid to say their opinion a lot more. And, I'm not saying this is true for everybody, whether if you played team sports or not, but I definitely noticed a pattern with that. And I had to learn how to navigate both sides and deal with like these different personalities in order to come to a consensus about certain things within the organization. And yeah, I think that the same way that I was raised, I think it's really important. There's so many valuable lessons that you learn that benefit you throughout your life from being competitive and put under pressure and having to be organized with the team. And, it goes back to like that Mike Tyson quote of everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And that's what I think is important about contact sports. It's 1 minute you're on top of the world, the next minute you're on your ass. And you got to learn how to react properly to do that. Not be rash and make poor decisions that ultimately hurt the team, but just take the punches, roll with it, and ultimately win.
And if there's anything more pertinent to a Bitcoiner, it's knowing how to take a punch in the face and keep on. And that may be said partly in jest, but that's part of what it is. I mean, we get knocked on our ass over and over and over again, and keep getting up. I think that resiliency is part of it. It almost becomes, when you get knocked on your ass like that, sometimes that makes you even more obstinate, more determined to win, right?
Yep.
And so, there's a lot going there. There's probably some papers or some study that, we could do in there psychoanalyzing those of us that are in the space. But I think that's a really important undercurrent. And I think when you compare Bitcoiners to a lot of the shitcoiners, I don't think that they're approaching that shitcoiner stuff with the same thing. I wouldn't be shocked to find a completely different psychological profile and background in those than us.
I definitely agree with that, and I say this all the time. I think that because I'll go to the Ethereum conferences in Denver, and I try to make it every year. And I believe in open communication and understanding what's going on with people. I think that there's things to be learned. I mean, there's a lot. I view a lot of what's happening in Ethereum and the other worlds as like an outsourced R&D sector for technologies that'll eventually emerge within Bitcoin, probably a lot further down the line, and for good reason. But yeah, when I go there and I'll talk to Ethereum developers and people that are involved in different DAOs. And if there's one thing I notice, it's a massive cultural difference. They're very fundamentally different personalities where, people that you meet in the Bitcoin world have like a set of principles that they're abiding by. And they're trying to implement those in some form, broadly speaking, you see that often. And then in the Ethereum world, it's a lot of very intellectually curious personalities, people that are like, oh, I want to pursue this. This is cool. This does something I find is interesting and valuable. It's something that captivates my attention. And they're kind of motivated in that regard. They're not motivated as much as I'm going to define this core set of principles and drive some sort of revolution. They're motivated in intellectual curiosity. Doesn't mean they're bad people. It just means that they're a very different psychology. And I think that so much of the gap between the two different sides probably just emerges from a fundamentally different motivation from which people are ultimately building what they're building.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I had interrupted you. I think you started to talk a little about your Bitcoin journey. And so I should probably let you get back to that, and then we'll get into the book a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I first heard about Bitcoin, I technically first bought Bitcoin when we were getting fake IDs in college, and we were buying those from China. I think it was a purchase. It was like 200 Bitcoin that we used to make that purchase. but yeah, but but I didn't think much of it back then. It wasn't until my senior year in 2015 that I I had an economics professor that I was really close with, and he always had very interesting prompts that we would write a response to. And one of those was Bitcoin one time. And I did, some research on it. And I was trained in like the Keynesian area. Now, that being said, I spent a lot of my free time understanding, I was primarily reading from like the monetarist school, but more like free market capitalist, Friedman's Soul, um, and Henry Hazlitt, and a lot of these other different names. I didn't really get a ton of exposure to Austrian thinkers other than like I'd say Hayek. He was the one that I did. And but anyways, so I was educating myself and I was very free market the entire time, but that's not enough. I mean, there's only so much you can read. And then there's a lot of like, when the fundamentals of your macroeconomic classes are teaching you things that are, probably very different than what the Austrian school would get into. I didn't necessarily think that I understand when you're putting together a curriculum, it's hard to teach everybody everything, but I definitely felt as if it was pretty biased. But wrapping that back around, we had a prompt for a response to Bitcoin. And just my thinking at the time was, this is just a speculative investment with no fundamental value. The other piece of that too is my financial education. In the school I went to, they were very focused on giving us a similar education to what you get in the CFA curriculum, which I subsequently got after I graduated. So I always had that framework in my mind as well. And, nobody ever really discusses concepts of like monetary value or gets deep into these topics. It wasn't part of my undergrad curriculum. It wasn't really mentioned at all in the CFA. And I was applying these market value based frameworks to it. And for years I wrote it off because of that. And I was just like, look, maybe it's a technology. Maybe it's worth something. I don't disagree. It looks like it's doing some pretty cool things and these might be valuable, but I don't know how to value this thing. And if I can't value it, then I can't make a legitimate, risk adjusted purchase on it. And that was the big thing that turned me off from Bitcoin for a while. And I was lucky that I had a friend who actually fell into that intellectually curious camp. And he had a hard time always describing it to me because we were kind of talking different languages, but he was always just pushing it with me. He's like, look, man, it's really cool. This is changing a lot of things. He didn't know how to describe it from the financial framework to me, but he kept talking about it. And then, that kept me reading about it. And then eventually, once I realized like, oh, this is an alternative monetary good, and this was back in like 2016, 2017 range. And I was always very critical of central banking. I believe that nobody should have that degree of control over any economy, and to assume that humans are capable of, implementing something successfully over such a complex system is, just an absurd notion. And once it clicked with me that Bitcoin is a solution of something that's not controlled as an alternative to central bank monetary policy, that was when I got really, really interested in it. But it's not an easy road starting there because, well, once you break the ice and you're like, okay, I really do see a value proposition here, and I still hadn't reconciled it with my financial framework yet, but it was interested enough to keep me reading deeper. Well, then you get led into the spider web of knowledge of, well, what do the other ones do? Bitcoin was the first one. The other ones must be better because they came after and they do more things. And you spend quite a bit of time researching that. And I was spending all this time researching different consensus mechanisms, algorithms, and trying to figure out all those details because it's all such a foreign language to you back then. And you're just like, well, that sounds like a good idea. Oh, proof of stake isn't using real world assets. That sounds cheaper. That's good. And you just walk your way through this whole path of knowledge. And it took me a while. It wasn't until 2018, 2019 range that I really came back around to the idea of like, oh, there's actually some very glaring issues with these alternatives. And I ultimately believe that Bitcoin is the base layer upon which everything else is going to get built. These have valuable characteristics that I think will ultimately be replicated within a Bitcoin native system over the long term. But you have to get very deep to ultimately get there. And then, and it's still, of course, there's, it's still highly speculative. I never try to purport any of these things as a certainty when I'm dealing with people, because it's not a certainty yet, but it is certainly the best risk adjusted, bet I think that I could make in my life. And also just because it aligns so much with my values, I find an incredible amount of purpose being a part of it. So, even if it was a lot riskier than it is, I don't know what else I'd want to do. I think it's solving the biggest problem in the world. So that's when I was like, kind of once they
Yeah.
started to get to that point. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could there, I think this is a good chance maybe to unwrap a little bit there, because I find your journey fascinating. I have a technical degree, but I have a minor degree in economics, whatever the hell that's worth. I got Keynesian economics shoved down my throat. I
Yeah.
graduated college in 1986, but I can tell you the world hasn't changed in the roughly 30-year gap between when I was in college and you were in college. Nothing changed. And I started down the Austrian path in about 2002, and just, self-study, and some personal things drove me to that, some certain disillusionment with it. And I think one of the hardest things about Bitcoin is, I think there's almost nobody that comes at it as a pure Austrian guy like that. That's all they ever knew. There's very few of those. You either know nothing about money and economics, which is most people, or if you, I don't know, if you have an MBA, you have an economics degree, a finance degree, you dabbled in some superficial Keynesian stuff. And I think you're often led to believe that you have an understanding of money and banking and monetary networks and things like that, even though you don't. And so you have to realize that, I mean, to me, it's crap. The Keynesian stuff is largely crap, but even if it's not, I think one of the disservices that occurs in universities is that they don't teach multiple perspectives. That, because the Austrian thought and the Keynesian thought, and there's obviously all kinds of nuances off of that, but I'll divide the world into those two to keep it simple. There's just so little, not even a 1%. Like you could go through and get a master's in economics without having read Hayek or Mises or Mises, or you go through the whole thing without ever having even read a single piece of literature from these guys. And that's, I mean, to me, that's terrible.
Yep.
Just absolutely terrible.
Yep. And I was lucky to have there was a professor in college, Dr. Thomas, who he had a strong Austrian background. He had a picture of Hayek behind him in his office, and him and I would spend a lot of time during office hours and after school hours, and he was very open with his time with me, and he'd help me think through a lot of these problems. And I was lucky to have a professor like that who was still open. And it was interesting because I having all the exposure that I did with him outside of the classroom, and us just having heart-to-heart conversations all the time, I definitely noticed that when he was teaching his curriculum, he was afraid a bit to talk about some of these things. And afraid might not be the right word, but very hesitant and very careful to put any of those ideals into the curriculum, which now that I have a lot more knowledge that I have, back then I was kind of like, okay, these might be a little bit more extreme, but now that I have the knowledge that I do, I don't think that's valid at all, and I don't think that it's I don't think extreme would be the right word at all. And I think that I think it's him worried. It's there is the audience capture that you have within a university, and there is the government incentives that are provided to researchers, and the fear of social exclusion, and all these motivations that create these forms of groupthink among academics. And I think that there's probably quite a bit of academics out there, just based on this anecdotal evidence that I had in college. I bet that there's quite a bit of academics out there who believe in a lot of these things, and they're actually just kind of afraid to be, they don't want to be the nail that sticks out and gets the hammer.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think people listening to me know I live in South Florida, and I live very close to Florida Gulf Coast University. Recently, they got a new dean at the School of Business named Dean Wesley, and he happens to come from an Austrian school of thought. And so I've gotten to know him and a couple of the other professors there. And they have over the last 2 years brought me in as a guest lecturer in several different classes, usually 2 to 5 times per semester. I'll go and drop into a class and I'll teach, one class, and I'll bring that perspective. But they've never said this overtly, but I think part of the reason they bring me in is none of them want to actually be the one to say what has to be said here. That it's easy to bring me in as a guest lecturer, and I can't get fired. I can't get, whatever.
Right.
And so that may be part of the reason. I appreciate the opportunity, and it's funny. Usually the classes I'm going into are either junior or senior level classes, occasionally a graduate class. But it's very, very clear that when I talk about central banking, the way I talk about kind of everything in the whole broad spectrum, all the different kind of aspects of Austrian thought and separation of state and money and things like that, that it's very clear they're hearing this for the very first time.
Yeah.
Absolutely the first time.
Yeah. Yep. It's absolutely true. I was amazed at some of the things that weren't discussed in some of my classes. And it was after a few years of it. It was kind of towards my senior year. I was a bit more outspoken in classes. Like I remember, this was one of the most interesting things. It wasn't directly related to different theories of economics, but I was in this economic development class, and the professor was much more, very, very far left. And, she was advocating for a lot of these wealth redistribution programs, in the sense of they, benefit economic development. And it was a valuable class. I learned quite a bit. And a lot of I think that the class was good at identifying issues that exist, and in understanding, how they could potentially be emerging. But some of the solutions that they would focus on to some of these issues, we had this one case study, and it was and the details are a little foggy to me around the whole thing, but it was basically it was this wealth redistribution program that was trying to entice parents to put their kids into schools, and it was in it was in a South American economy, but it was called Oportunidades. That's what I remember. And I remember, I was reading the case study, and then the case study that we were given in class, so we're gonna have to speak to and have some Socratic seminar on the following week. It played this off as just being this perfect program. It did everything that it was supposed to do. And I was just like, there's no way it performed this well. There had to have been some complications. So I go and just research it online. And I find, plenty of very valid sources stating all the major issues that occurred with this program, none of which was listed in the source we were given. And the most striking one to me that surprised me that she would even give us this case study was that they had changed the initial sample size. It was about like 36 different educational school systems. And that was their starting sample size. I think it was somewhere in like the 5 to 10 year range in which they did the measurement of the success of the program. And by the end of it, the schools that they threw out and had replaced in the finishing sample size that they measured, over 20 of the schools that were in the original sample size. So, I mean, we're not even talking about the same group of schools anymore. And it just, the data was false. And I sent her like a scathing email about that, because that, I'm sitting here paying money for an education. And this is being taught to me. And then it was the funniest thing to me, because I sent her this email, and then all she responded was, yeah, I can address some things with the class on this. And then we go to class the next day, and she ended up not doing a Socratic seminar, and she just talked through the case study with us. And then at the end of it, she goes, by the way, a student brought up that there were some issues in the program, and if you guys want to read about that, you could, go online or reach out to me. I could give you some sources on that. That was like all she said to it. And that just, I remember how much that upset me. That's why I still remember it to this day, because I couldn't even believe that was going on. And And you shouldn't be paying $40,000 a year and have to be so damn skeptical of the people that are educating you.
Yeah, that's a great story. I think it's true in academia. It's clearly true in politics. It's clear in journalism. And I grew up. I'm a different generation, a couple different generations different from you. When I was younger, I think we held journalists and people in academia at this massively high level, and at least certainly I did, almost could do no wrong sort of thoughts. I mean, politicians always have been tainted, but I think, by the way, I think now in hindsight, they were just as bad as they are now. It's just that it was harder then to call them on things like that. Like, you were able to look at this case study and then something didn't sound right, so you went out and searched for it. Well, in 1986, what would you do? In 1975, what would you do? I mean, if you want to go dedicate your life to looking through microfiche news stories and things like that, maybe you could have figured it out, but very, very hard. And but I also think what's interesting is I find that the fundamental problems, political parties, for instance, are separated almost less by the problems, but by the solutions they wish to pursue. And that almost in and of itself defines it. That and generally, left-leaning people, progressives, will want to solve it with committees and oversight and government, and right will want to solve it through free market and free market kind of pursuit. Let the best idea win, let the market decide, sort of thing. But usually the root causes are so, and it's when each side, I'm not even taking a side here, when they point fingers at each other, though, they usually are calling them bad names. You're a fascist, you're a socialist, I mean, that's kind of how it goes. And it's a sad state of affairs. And again, going back to even that thing I said about Piaget and the Jordan Peterson thing, I think the beauty of Bitcoin is, it is what it is. The rules are well defined. The outcome is well defined, at least in Bitcoin terms, right? The outcome is well defined. We know when the difficulty adjustment's going to occur. We know when the halving's going to occur. We know what will happen with the monetary supply. All those sort of things are known. We have control through our nodes if we wish. We can audit. I mean, all those sorts of things are truisms, and I think the world greatly needs those. If I could, I know we could go on and on, probably down some of these rabbit holes, but I think maybe we can get to the book, and I think one of the things I wrote down is early, I think in the intro to the book, you wrote something that says, this book contains the foundational ideas I wish someone had given me back in 2015. And that's a quote from the book. And I thought, I mean, it's a very simple statement, but I think all of us who've taken this multi-year journey, feel that same way. That I'm class of 2017. Sounds like you were class of 2015-ish, or they're about
2017. Yeah.
So how much smoother would that journey have been for us had this book, and there's a couple other good ones out there, but this one's excellent, if they had been there. And so maybe talk just a little bit about how did you get to that point and said, what, I'm going to be the guy that writes the book I wish
right. Yeah, absolutely. It really started, so it is perfect because that segues right back into the story that I was telling. But Yeah, I was at this private equity firm, and Bitcoin had been building up over time, and eventually I got to a level of understanding of it where I was like, okay, this is a very highly probable outcome that we have a solution to fiat central banking here. And I wasn't nearly as deep as I am now back then, but I had enough of an understanding to really feel confident in where it's going. And a lot of it was like, and I won't get into the details around all that, but a lot of it was just career oriented. I'd been working hard to get this job in a competitive area of finance, and I had a lot of hopes and desires of what that would be, and it didn't quite amount to it. And after working in it for over a year, I was kind of like, okay, well, I'm not in love with this. And then I asked myself, well, what is it that I want to do? And that was a pretty hard question. It took me a while to ultimately ask myself that question, because I'd invested so much time and effort to get to where I was. It was just always a certainty. I'd been doing this for almost 6 or 7 years, or longer than that, almost 8 or 9 years. I'd been trying to pursue this goal, and then once it hit me, and I was just like, okay, and I said it out loud. I was like, okay, well, what do I want to do? And that just got me thinking about a lot of things. It got me thinking about Bitcoin, and I was just like, I could jump into this industry. It's what I care about. There's a story that I want to tell the world around a lot of this, and then also what I enjoyed, like one of my differentiators, I think, when I was working, in a traditional finance, was that I'd work with a lot of very highly analytical people, but one of my differentiating traits was I could communicate well, and I could do that in a way, and I could communicate with people at like different levels pretty well too, and also still have the analytical chops to get into the work. And that's not something that it is rewarded in my area of work, but not in the same way that it would be, with what we're doing right now. And we're talking on podcasts, and you can have more expansive platforms and things like that. So that was another thing that was really interesting to me. And I just decided, it was a huge leap of faith. I went from this guy who was, planning, his entire career 5, 6 years in advance to, here's something that I think I could really enjoy. I'm not exactly certain what it's going to be yet, but I'm going to get. I was rational about it. I had a few years runway, and I was like, okay, I've got enough runway here to where I can probably just jump all in on this and figure it out, which I needed to do just because I work pretty long hours. I didn't have the time to really get as deep as I wanted in some of these areas. So that's what made me make the jump into the industry. And I had no plans to write a book or anything. I just kind of broadly knew I want to have my own business. I want to find a way to support this, new movement that's occurring, and do that in a way that's in line with the things that I'm good at, and that I enjoy, and that the world needs. And that's basically the only thought that I really had when I made the decision. I said, I'd give me a few years and I could probably figure it out. And, step one after I did that was to just start getting really deep into a lot of areas. I still had all these questions in my head, like, okay, well, I kind of know how this is, but I really want to figure it out very clearly for myself. So I put together this whole curriculum, because there's not really any sort of Bitcoin curriculum, and I think the ones that do exist are probably not great. There's good educational resources out there, but at least back then, there was like there's different blockchain certifications and stuff like that, or like the MIT course. And I think that really there's a lot better stuff that you can put together a much better curriculum if you piece a lot of things together. And that was effectively what I was doing. So this was towards the end of 2019, a little bit before the pandemic started. And so I just got deep into a bunch of reading, and it was one of the best parts of my life, where I spent 9 months just pursuing every curiosity that I had. And it was kind of along the way, I started off just getting deep into the more technical side of Bitcoin, and I had not a very limited background in computer science. I had no education. We would deal, I due diligence semiconductor companies and things like that when I was at the private equity firm. So I had very limited understanding of how computers even worked, and I had to teach myself quite a bit around that. I still don't have a great understanding, but I know enough to be dangerous, at least on topics of Bitcoin. And so I had to, I wanted to get deep. And in my prior job, we would, if I want to understand an investment or a company, then I have to model out all the details of it. I have to understand how it's working. I got to, open the hood and see, figure out what the engine is. And so I wanted to do that with Bitcoin. And then I was like, okay, well, Jimmy Song has a programming Bitcoin book for the Python language. And I was like, okay, well, I don't know Python. So I taught myself Python, and then I could get to his book. And I read, the only actual economics finance book that I had read that was a Bitcoin book was the Bitcoin Standard. And And other than that, it was just mastering Bitcoin. There was another book, Bitcoin and Cryptocurrency Technologies. There's a Princeton professor and I think one at Ann Arbor, Michigan, and a few others that wrote that together. And that's more, it's not like a Bitcoin only type book, but it's an academic book that I think is highly valuable. And it's effectively a textbook, and I feel like not enough people talk about it, but I think it's a really good one. It gives you a good understanding of the history of Bitcoin and kind of talks about things in a different framework. So I'd read a good amount of these sources, and I was like, okay, well, I get the Bitcoin side now. And then there was a lot of economics questions that I still had outstanding too. And, I was reading into economic history of money. The biggest thing that I knew wasn't really a part of anything in the Bitcoin curriculum was like, how does central banking really work, and how does the Federal Reserve actually work in a way that is digestible for a lot of people to understand? Because you have these sources at two ends of the spectrum. It's either like an Investopedia level discussion of how it works, or it's some very academic type paper. And I wanted to, kind of put something that was in the middle, though most people could probably get their head around, but it was still deep enough to where you're not oversimplifying things. And which was hard when I was writing the book on some of this stuff, because it's very hard to like toe that line correctly. But anyways, so it was really just as I started reading, I was like, okay, well, what's step one? And I was just trying to, think in terms of the hardest part from moving from what I was doing before into entrepreneurship was trying to take away my mindset of very long-term planning and saying like, okay, you need to figure out how to optimize your next step. You're looking down at your feet again. You don't have your head up. You need to say, okay, well, I know that I could do this and this would be good, and it's not going to hurt me, and I'm not going to regret spending time doing that. And I kind of was just had this process of decision making doing that. And the next step for me after I got deep into a lot of reading was like, okay, well, I should really write a lot of this out. I have tons of notes on everything, but I really need to regurgitate it so that I can get my head around it. And I started writing about it, which led me to the ideas like, okay, well, I could put together a series of blog posts. That'd probably be a really valuable way of doing this. And then I was writing all of that, and after the more I kept writing, I was like, I'm writing so much here that I'm effectively going to just write a book on all of this. And then that's when the idea came to me. I was like, well, I guess I could write a book. And I just kind of fell into the idea of writing a book at that point. And it was an awesome journey. It was one of my favorite things I've done. Just spending time, and when you're in the weeds of all of it, just nonstop, you're completely immersed in thought around one topic for months on end. And it's just a very good feeling. You're not worried about anything else in the world. And so I set down that, and eventually I got it finished. And then it was the summer of 2021 that I finally published it. So the research process was probably around 9-10 months, and then the writing process was probably another 5 months of like getting the initial draft together. But then it's I had a market of people that I reviewed on a scale of different understandings to like see how they perceived what I was writing, and then I gave it to an editor and then a designer, and then I pushed it out on Amazon. So that was like another 4 months of some of that after I finished the initial draft. And that was just kind of the first step. And then the nice thing about all that was it gave me what I told myself was, I was like, maybe it's a successful book, maybe it's not, but worst case scenario, I'm going to understand exactly what I think, and that's going to be really valuable for what I do in the future.
Well, it's first of all, it's an excellent effort. I think I've already said that. And knowing that you don't have a technical background, and we won't talk about it really, I don't think today for time constraints, but the technical sections of the book are done quite well. So those of you out there in the second half of the book, where Eric, talks about things like, what's a private address and what's a public key, and how are those things generated, and all that. It's really some of the best that I've seen done, and so compliments to you, Eric. And I also will say that as a writer, I haven't written a book, but I've written a lot of articles, written a lot of things. I write for Bitcoin Magazine. There's nothing better than having to write something to understand it, and you can't fake it. You can't, and so I would almost say to people out there, whether you ever want to publish something or not, if there's something that you want to understand, then go write a paper about it. You probably would have hated if you realize in hindsight, why did they make us write papers in school? Well, most people probably hated it. I probably did quite a bit, even though I always loved to write, but somebody say, well, write about this or write about that. Well, you have to understand it. You have to do at least a mini version of the process that you went through to do it right. And at the end of it, well, yeah, I got it. Right. Now, kind of getting into the book a bit, I want to just talk about the beginning part of the book, which is a lot of, it's not Bitcoin related. It's I think those fundamental building blocks that you have to really get Bitcoin. And also building on some of the things we talked about before. The very first chapter is called Dimensions of Money. And, my summary was like, what is money? Who controls it? Who decides what money is? The salability of money, like those sorts of things. And what strikes me, even as a guy that has some education, for instance, in economics, I wasn't taught any of those things. Like you jump into, usually you get microeconomics 101. I don't care what college you go to, you probably get microecon 101 is probably in everybody's curriculum. Like why in the world do we start there?
Right.
Why in the world do we start there? Why don't we talk about what money is? How does it work? And even debate the pros and cons of who controls it.
Yep.
And so, maybe you can, you obviously led your book that way. I think it was an excellent choice,
Yep.
but maybe just talk a little bit about, why you chose that as a starting point.
Yep, absolutely. It's definitely that's the first question that everybody needs to answer. So like, to your point, the first half of the book is just defining all the problems correctly, because what I'll see in a lot of discussions, and mistakes that I'd made too when I was first understanding Bitcoin, and I'd try to explain to people like, what is Bitcoin? And then I'd immediately start jumping in and start explaining how Bitcoin works. And that's not how you need to, ultimately display the value proposition of Bitcoin, because most people don't understand the problems that it's solving. Most people are totally unaware of all of what's going on. They just think, most people think it's capitalism's fault. And that was the most important piece, I think, is you have to just very clearly define the problems, which means you need to understand money. You need to understand the theory behind it. You need to understand how it's evolved over time. And you need to understand the banking system, which was a huge part of that later in its evolution. And then you also have to understand how it works today, because the hardest part is you can go through history and explain how money and banking have worked, and it gets very, that's something that's a lot easier to explain. But once you try to explain this warped system that we exist within today, it is so ass backwards that it's very hard to explain to people when you're just like, well, money is debt. And then people are like, what the hell does that mean? And it's like, we created this circular function within our economy. It actually doesn't make sense. And when I got off, I was like, okay, well, the first starting point is explaining money and moving off of that theory. And then you could eventually build up to the banking system, and then you can explain, well, here's fiat money, and you can decide for yourself whether or not you think that makes sense. But the problem that I think I noticed from what I'd read, and I didn't think that there was a lot of resources that were explaining. There were, people would hear about, well, here's the functions of money, and it's a store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account. And then people would hear about, well, here are the properties of money, and it's scarce, and it's divisible, and all these other properties. And then, people would read the Bitcoin standard and safety and would say, well, money exists across 3 dimensions, time, space, and scales. And then, people would talk about money salability from, the theory defined by Carl Menger in the 19th century. And I was like, okay, so there's all these different concepts floating around about what is money. And I said, there's got to be a way to just tie this all together in a simple framework for people. So that was my task that I set out for on the first chapter, is to say, everybody's probably got a little bits and pieces of all this. How do we put this into a unified framework that people can understand, and they can ultimately see like how money would emerge when violence isn't a part of that system? And that was a goal. And really, I put together this chart, and that's probably like the most shared aspect of the book online, is that chart in chapter 1. Chapter 1 is also probably the most highly acclaimed chapter of the book, which I'm glad, because that probably keeps people reading. So I put together this chart where I'm like, Yeah, at the highest level, we have saleability of money. And that's just really how Carl Menger defined it. He said, money is just the most saleable good. It's the good that people really can't get enough of. And he defines that through thinking about it from diminishing margin of utility. All the goods in the world, money is just another good, but all the goods in the world are goods that have some form of diminishing margin of utility. Just a long word for saying is you consume more of something, you enjoy it less, you get less utility from it. Your first house gives you way more utility than your second or your third. Same goes for food, same goes for anything else. Money is the one that declines the least. You could have all the money in the world, it's not going to make you happy. But if a genie came to you and said, I'll give you anything to an infinite amount, the smart person would say, well, give me money. And that's the good you want, because it's the most saleable. You can trade it for anything else. You can sell it very easily. And so that's at the highest level how it's defined. And then safety, talks about, well, that saleability, that concept exists across three dimensions: time, space, and scale. And really the way that I like to describe that is money allows us to move value through those dimensions. So within time, it allows us to move value across time. Within space, it allows us to port it across space. Within scales, it allows it to be grouped and divided. And that's really what the three functions of money are describing. And they're saying, well, if something's a good store of value, then it moves money across time very well. And if it's a good medium of exchange, then it moves it across spaces very well. And that's why it became so widely accepted. And, same goes for if it's a good unit of account, you can, divide and group very easily. And then, so like that's tying all that together. And I think what you really boil this all down to, when you have these three different dimensions and these three functions it serves, how do you fundamentally assess what is a good and bad money? Well, it boils down to the monetary properties as the final piece. And if there's inherent properties to money that exist, and if a money has, is the best across all properties, then that is the form of good that is likely to emerge as money. There's, at any given point in time, there's some good out there that would be the best form of money, considering, that there's no violence implemented in the system. So when you break it all down, it's like, okay, well, if you were to fundamentally assess a form of money by the six properties, is it scarce? Is it divisible? Is it portable? Is it widely accepted? Is it fungible? You assess it across these properties. And then if you were to say, and it's, somewhat quantitative in certain dimensions and then somewhat qualitative in others, but whatever has the best properties is ultimately what would be privately chosen as money. And that's kind of the core way to think about money, is from its perspective of properties. And that flows into everything else that I described in the beginning. So that was the that was the goal of the first chapter, was to explain that well for people and get into the weeds around how to really get your head around that. And then once you have that framework, then we can really start getting into how money works, and then you can really contrast that concept with what we've turned money into today, and just how ridiculous it's become.
Yeah, well, it's an excellent chapter. I'm not surprised it's the one that you've gotten at least the most positive feedback for, or accolades for, because we can't go anywhere without it. And I think that's what's interesting is, we talked about education systems and all that. When I still go to university today and I speak with students, their minds are so clouded by things where about regulation, like you've talked about violence. We won't have time to go into that today, but I certainly, the way property rights are enforced, the way money is used as a policing tool, the way it's used as a weapon, those, I think in modern thought and often in academia, those things have been blended in with store of value,
Right.
unit of exchange and unit of account, is like, well, no, it's also a means by which we police and enforce and weaponize people. And we hear central banks, we hear bankers, as they're pushing towards CBDCs and things like that. Those are fundamental attributes, of what they're after. And they've blended them in and blurred the line. And I think it's very important that in your book you bring it back to there. And I think all of us in the Bitcoin world, as we're all trying to orange pill people at certain points in time, I think that this is such an important message. This is what money is. This is what it should be, and we can't bastardize it. We can't create all this contagion around it with these other things.
Right. And what's interesting is I remember in college, when we did cover the topic of money, briefly said, I just remember it was some minor portion of a chapter, and it was it was this very cursory review of, well, here's property's money. And here are the functions that it serves, and we know this, and let's move on. And
Yeah.
that was it. It was probably 20 to 30 minutes of my life spent in college covering that.
Yeah, you probably had
and,
one test that said list 3 properties of money, and
right,
or which of these, it's a 4-piece multiple choice question, which is not a property of money, and it would say something stupid like
right,
I don't know, cultivating soil, like
right, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it was, what was interesting too is I remember in college, the way that store of value is defined in the curriculum, and you see that today, but there's actually, there's this difference in the definition of store of value to different people, because we're defining it as, and the Austrians would define it as, and, historically it was defined as maintaining value over time. And the way that I was educated on store value in college was that it maintains price stability. And that's a very interesting distinction, which shows the two different camps of economic thinking about the purpose of money. And I think at first I was kind of like, oh, they warped it, and they did, but it's not quite just like these are bad guys and they warped it. It's actually just a fundamentally different thinking around time preference. Because when you say price stability on a store value, that just means it stores value in a shorter period of time better. And that's kind of, it's a different framework of thinking. It's a lower time preference thinking around economics. We went short-term price stability at the cost of this, persistent long-term inflation that ultimately ends in, a crashing debt cycle.
Yeah. Which I think everybody, if you weren't aware of it before, should understand it now. Even if you're not a Bitcoiner, you should see what's happening in the world. There's a segue here in the second chapter, which is called The History of Decentralized Money. There were several things, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to pick 2 to talk about, but one is a good segue here. There's a quote in there. I don't know if it's your quote or if it's a Hayek or somebody like that, but it says the production of money is more subject to moral hazard than any other good. And so I think that's a great quote. And maybe I'll let you, as the author, I don't know if that was your quote or you got that from somebody, but it's a great quote.
I really appreciate you calling that out. You're the first person who's mentioned that, and it was that was my quote. And it's when I was getting into the theory around moral hazard, and I thought about the salability of goods, and I was connecting the dots, and I was like, well, if what has always had the greatest conflict of interest within society, and actually, I guess to explain this point, I'll take a step back. So for everybody listening, there's the agency problem in economics, and that's defined as when you have a principal and an agent and there's a conflict of interest between those two, then the agent is going to take advantage of the principal in some form. So a good way you could think about that is if you were to hire a courier to deliver some paper documents for you to somebody else, you pay them $100, you could reasonably expect that they're going to deliver those documents around town. Now, if you give them $1 million worth of gold to go deliver, you're probably not going to get that delivery made, and you're never going to see them again, because you created a conflict of interest. They gain more value by defecting from your agreement. And that's ultimately what the agency problem is describing, is that when you have that with your agents, some form of moral hazard results. People do not abide by the agreements that are set when they have a conflict of interest. And that's why we see that problem so prevalent in financial institutions, and any institution where them ultimately defecting from your agreement benefits them more in some form. It's an economic, it's an economic, not law. I don't want to use the term law, but it's a very firm economic principle that that's what's going to occur.
Yeah.
And
it's almost a human nature,
right?
That there's probably a few people in the world not predisposed to it, but you can count them on one hand. all the rest of us eventually in that position probably find the temptation of the
right
too great.
Yeah, if you want Mother Teresa to be your financial advisor, then you might be safe. But other than that, you're going to have some form of conflict of interest, and that's why the financial industry is it has this pervasive issue of fraud that occurs, and why it's also become, and there's a few arguments for why it's become this way. One of which, though, and it's ultimately used as a scapegoat in a lot of scenarios, and for good reason, is that there is fraud that occurs because it's so subject to moral hazard, and because of that, it needs more regulation to protect consumers. And so that was one of the key insights that I brought about was, when it comes to control over money, moral hazard, no other good is subject to moral hazard more so than money is. And we've seen that pattern throughout history. And every single time any sort of institution, whether it be government, whether it even be like private market, if their incentives are misaligned, then you will see some form of moral hazard. And that's what's so key. That's the primary innovation about Bitcoin, is that it removes the moral hazard inherent within money, or the possibility of its existence, through decentralization, which is just so important. It's like it's incredible that we're alive right now.
Absolutely. And the history of money is such that the proof of this, there's 5,000 years of proof of this, over and over and over and over. And by the way, another fascinating thing, we're kind of beating up on academia and education today. Again, something that won't even be mentioned. I mean, you're going to have to go deep into the history of money and banking and things like that to extract that this is the case. And I love the quote. It's very cool that it's yours. It like I said, you could have told me it was Hayek, and I would have believed it. So my hat's off to you for that.
Thanks, Bob.
So now, speaking of that history of money, also in this, I think there's something very important. It's a word, and the word is coin. And you talk about coinage, talk about the kings of Lydia, being the first issuers of coin. And I think in our world, almost all use of the word coin is as a noun, but in reality, it's more a verb.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about the change from weights to count and what we're trying to accomplish. And I think this is, I'm gonna come back to this later when we talk about the Constitution a little bit. But I think this is very important for people to understand the true meaning of this word and the history of this word. And so, maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I never thought about it that way, but yeah, comparing it as a verb to a noun is a great way of describing that. So what was interesting is, we had this pattern when private monies emerged, and the reason, when you're mentioning chapter 2, and I call it the decentralized history of decentralized monies, I'm talking about in a lot of these primitive forms of money, they actually had a lot of decentralized properties. And there's kind of, there's three ways that intermediaries really would get involved in money, and that's through its production, through its storage, and through its verification. And when we look at primitive societies, when they were in localized groups, these systems made sense, but everybody was producing money themselves, they were storing it themselves, and they were verifying it amongst one another themselves as well. And as money evolved over time, there are these different efficiencies that we gained. And we said, okay, well, we're using these primitive forms of money like seashells and, certain types of rocks and axes and flint and pelts and all these different things. But if we use precious metals, these actually have a lot better monetary properties. And because of that, we ultimately evolved to precious metals. But in order for us to make these evolutionary steps in money, it required specialization in some form around those three forms of intermediation of production, storage, and verification. So when we had that occur, a key step was, once, we had blacksmiths who would ultimately, had miners, they'd mine the gold, then they'd bring it to blacksmiths, we'd put it into ingots. And then once that occurred, people realized it was very inefficient to carry around a gold bar with you all the time. If you want to go trade with a merchant, you got to go shave off different flakes of it. And that was one of the reasons that, the bimetallic system of gold and silver existed, was because silver wasn't as scarce as gold, which meant it wasn't as valuable per unit of weight. And that made it better to conduct trade, because if you're going to chop off of a silver block versus a gold block, you lose some amount of your gold and silver when you're doing that. You'd rather lose silver than you would rather lose gold. So it made a lot more sense to conduct those, conduct that trade through silver. And so that was one way of solving the problem. But, eventually it led us to coinage systems, which actually first emerged with merchant classes. And in merchant classes, we're saying, okay, well, we're always going through this process of trade where we have to cut off different pieces to get to the right weight that we need. What if we standardize these weights and remove that problem? Well, merchants started creating their own coinage. So what did that mean? specialization in the production of money by the merchant class. And as merchants gained more knowledge over that process and people were a bit more naive who weren't a part of that actual production process, they would trade different coins with one another. And merchants quickly realized, well, if we shave off a little bit on the edges of this coin and we accumulate enough of them over time, that eventually we can, save it up and mint new coins for ourselves. And then I'm trading the slightly lighter coin to another person, and they're none the wiser. And that was a key area of moral hazard that first started to emerge in coinage systems. And going back to the original point that you mentioned, that process effectively became coin clipping, was the term for it. And what we realized when we were going through that process is that when you get people to trust something other than the fundamentals of what money is, before it was a certain weight of gold is what we traded based off of. Once they trusted the coin itself, they said, if I just have this coin, it doesn't matter really how much it weighs. What just matters is that it says what it says on it. Once we get trust in that, we can manipulate the fundamentals of it. When it's always been the fundamentals that have mattered, and centralized intermediaries have always manipulated you to think that way. The same thing occurred with paper money. Once we got people to trust, rather than gold itself, we got them to trust paper notes. We could expand the supply, which is economically a very similar thing to coin clipping. We can expand the supply of paper notes. As long as people trust that paper notes are money and not gold, then we can manipulate something about that. And there's some sort of moral hazard inherent in it. And the process of coinage is really more just, it was, to your point, going back to that noun verb, people thought of coins in terms of them being nouns. And really when it was a process of coinage that really just converted it from its different function and trusting that's where the moral hazard ensued, was from that different type of thinking. If everybody was constantly verifying the weights of coins, then that probably wouldn't have happened. And it was because of that trust that it ultimately occurred.
Yeah. And you I think it's in the next chapter, talk about the Constitution and the founding fathers of the United States, and they were very aware of this issue. It was not an afterthought. And I'm going to quasi paraphrase it, but Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which is in the book, but it says Congress shall have the power to borrow money, to coin money, again the verb, to coin money, regulate the value of foreign coin, and fix the standards of weights and measures. So there's nothing in there about creating money. You can borrow it, you can coin it, meaning you can authenticate it, right? You're validating it, but you're not creating it. And to show how serious it is, like Jefferson said, a private central bank issuing the public currency is a greater menace to the liberties of the people than a standing army. Also in the book, George Mason said, paper money is founded upon fraud and knavery. Thomas Paine said, the punishment of a member who should move for such a law ought to be death. These guys weren't screwing around. I mean, they looked at this problem as, a fundamental tenet of a sound society and a lawful society. So I'll shut up for a second and let you comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was the role of government and money was a very highly controversial topic when at the foundation of the U.S. and it was a constant battle. And what we saw throughout history, not just in the U.S., is that it has been so hard throughout history to keep governments away from having control over the monetary creation process, because it's a source of revenue for them. And it really just is that simple. And because of that, we've never been able to really keep government's hands outside of money. And when we had these debates between Thomas Jefferson, who's kind of leading the government laissez-faire from the monetary system movement, and then we had Alexander Hamilton, who and there's a lot of speculation as to why, and he was a bit flip-floppy on some of his preferences during that period too, but he was leading towards it being a strong form of he was stating what he probably actually believed about it, but he was saying that it's associated with wealth within an economy. We can garner money from this, and that's a good thing. And it's just, nobody is really told just how controversial that is. And
Yeah.
It's amazing, because shouldn't that be a major aspect of our historical education? I feel like it
Yeah.
should be probably one of the biggest highlights. And yeah, and it's funny how little that's actually discussed.
Yeah.
It's also the wisdom of their quotes tells you. We look at it as wisdom because we say we live in this society, but maybe it wasn't even wisdom. Maybe it was just that things have been so bad that this is glaringly obvious, and some people are picking one side where they actually want freedom, and other people are picking another side where, um, they have some sort of wealth that they ultimately want to capture based off of it.
Well, I think that's certainly true. See, it was a different world then. I can't say that I understand it completely,
Right.
but I don't think people should poo-poo it. In my mind, the creation of the Fed itself is unconstitutional, and
Hmm.
we only have a handful of minutes left here today, so we won't go down that path. But I think it doesn't seem to be challenged. You actually have a quote in the book where you, I believe it's in your book. Hopefully I remember this right, but basically says, central banking used to be a common topic for politicians. And, with the exception of Ron Paul, I don't think we've had a politician, and I'm 58 years old. I don't recall a politician, at least in my adult life, that has made it an issue. And whether right or left, by the way, it doesn't matter, that you see nobody voicing this. And I think that they all understand, again, right or left, that there's a phenomenal amount of power that comes with the Fed, and none of them want to give it up. And we'll go back to that production of money and moral hazard thing. That's a big deal. And so,
Yep.
throw out progressive and conservative and all that other stuff, all about the money and the control of the money.
Right. That's something that both sides of the aisle can always agree on. And yeah, thinking about it in this way, that's actually a great way to contrast it, is just how little this topic is part of the public discussion today versus how prevalent it was during the Constitutional Convention of our country.
Yeah. Yeah. And, go ahead.
One other thing I wanted to show, I forgot that this was sitting on my desk. This is actually a silver Roman denarii. And if you can see the edges of it, yeah, they're clipped off around here. And the other thing, that's coin clipping. And on the back, you can see that gash in the middle of it. That was so that they could verify the contents in the middle of it and they weren't copper, which is that's how people would be verifying these coins.
Awesome little thing that shared with us there. That's great. So I know I could talk with you for a long time. I think we got to about 3 chapters of the book, and just some little nuggets. We have a game we play here that I'd like to close on. It's probably a good time to segue to it. So I'm going to share my screen here, and the game. And do you see that okay here, Eric? You see this?
Yep, there it is.
Okay. So the game we play is Corrupt or Incompetent. And we've got 4 little tidbits here, and it gives you some free form thinking. You can by the way decide they're completely competent and utterly honest and truthful, but I doubt you will. So with that, first contestant, where we gotta go here. Give me one sec here. Okay, so first on the board is Robert Reich, former Secretary of Labor, and also on the Economic Transition Advisory Board for President Obama. He runs an economic organization. And for those of you listening only, this is a tweet. He says, "Reminder, inflation isn't being driven by government spending. It's largely being driven by the fact that a handful, 4 mega corporations, I think he's saying for-profit mega corporations, have consolidated their market power and can raise prices on consumers."
I gotta go with corrupt on this one. I think when it comes down to the inflation debate, there's definitely people that are myopic on both sides. There's people that are, blaming it all on government spending. There's people that are blaming it all on supply chains. But I think that anybody who's abiding by this narrative that it's consolidated market power of mega corporations and solely that is got to be corrupt. I mean, that's the most absurd out of all of them.
Yeah, well, you will get no argument from me. And it's again, this goes back to we have a population, unfortunately, that is highly illiterate on economic issues. And so when people like this, who, based on his credentials, you would expect to be highly reputable, say things like this, to me, the damage that they do is just, immeasurable.
Yep. And that's one of the biggest problems is I think that if people, if the majority of the population can see what happens behind closed doors with very intelligent, powerful people, that they could see that their trust in them is probably a bit misguided.
Yeah. Okay, second contestant. I believe you were just over in London, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So Sunday Times published some stories about crypto and how crypto finally cracked, the crypto inferno. Those are kind of headline banter, and they use the Bitcoin symbol on fire and crumbling in all of their graphics. And it's probably, this is for Eric, not for me, but I find those to be very interesting choices. And so I will leave.
I'm gonna lean on Incompetent with this one. I think that, well, number one, it's probably just a marketing thing where Bitcoin's the most familiar brand with everybody. Like, imagine if they were to throw Ethereum on there or something. There's a lot less people familiar with that brand anyways.
Yeah.
But I think it's probably just more incompetence and them putting it all into the same bucket. But there's probably a bit in, I'm not saying it's 100% that, but it's probably leans more that direction.
Okay. Fair enough. Okay, our third contestant today. Now, this is an older quote, to be fair, and I will read it to everybody, but I just found it just kind of repopulated. And I think because the Ethereum merge is coming up, I think this reemerged. But it says from Vitalik, essentially the founder, creator, driving force behind Ethereum, from 2017, though. The idea of average users personally validating the entire history of the system is a weird mountain man fantasy. There, I said it.
I think, what I think a lot of this goes back to is our conversation at the beginning of the podcast where we were describing the fundamental personality differences. I think that quite a bit of it goes down to that. I think that the fact is he thinks in terms of utility, and he's invested quite a bit of time in building out a protocol that attempts to capture that utility within the single layer, which is a very different vision for how Bitcoin views the financial system building out. And I think because he thinks in those terms, then it's easy for him to conclude that it's a weird mountain man fantasy that we're going to need centralization of the nodes in order for this vision to work. And I feel like it's just it's a fundamentally different vision that they're being driven by, and I think it's wrong. And I'm making the bet on the alternative. I think the internet was built in layers. I think the financial system was built in layers. I think the internet financial system is going to be built in layers.
I would agree. I think I wouldn't call him. I'm certainly not going to call him corrupt, at least not for this statement. I think there may be different value systems and different perspectives in play here. But what I will say is that when I read this, the realization to me was he never understood Bitcoin. And it meaning it never resonated with him. Obviously, by the way, an early adopter, a guy that was in Bitcoin and dedicated to it early on. But the aspects of it that got to him, I think, were purely technical. And you know, the philosophical ethos part of it never resonated with him. Because to me, I mean, here's one of the fundamental building blocks of Bitcoin, that, you know, that it's trustless, and I can validate everything. And, you know, to him, I mean, to each his own, right? To him, there's not value in that. You know?
Right.
Or at a minimum, that's certainly tradable for something else, where I think most of us, I'll speak for myself, I guess, would say, nope, that's unnegotiable. Like,
right.
Not negotiable. Like,
The entire value of the system is predicated upon it. And I think that when you throw that out the window, we're left with an inefficient database that's more transparent. People lose privacy on it.
Yep. Okay, last one. It wouldn't be Corrupt or Incompetent without a Jerome Powell video. So here we go.
Inflation is much too high, and we understand the hardship it is causing, and we're moving expeditiously to bring it back down. We have both the tools we need and the resolve that it will take to restore price stability on behalf of American families and businesses.
So my take on Jerome and everything is, you know, a lot of people make the argument against him like he's a lawyer, and he shouldn't even be in the position to be making this. But I think that even if you got, whether it was an Austrian economist, whether it was, and it's probably not the right decision to make, because that just would never, you know, it's kind of an absurd hypothetical in the first place. But you know, I guess a better way of saying it is, I don't think that anybody should be in the position of being the chairman of the Federal Reserve. I think it's an impossible job. I think you're doomed to fail. And I think you will always end up making the wrong decision, because you're being given control over something that's too complex for anybody to have control over. So I got to go with incompetence on Jerome Powell. And that being said, the corruption that's put him in this type of position in the first place, and the reason it exists, is also a big part of that.
I agree completely. And, you know, my biggest objection to them, given that we do have a Fed and we do have a Fed chair, I think the lack of honesty and transparency is what bothers me the most. To say that and it's very political too. Nobody ever wants to admit they made a mistake. Nobody ever wants to admit that they're not sure what's going to happen. So this air of, like this part of the quote, we have both the tools we need and the resolve that it will take to restore price stability. And he's up there trying to pretend like he's a master of the economy, and that he can move the dials in such a way that everything's going to be okay.
Right.
I mean, it would be much better to say, we don't know what the hell's going to happen. We hope this happens. We're doing this because we think it will do this, but we're really not sure. And, you know, that I would respect that at least. Right.
And that's one of the challenges of the Federal Reserve, is that, you know, so much of their job is just manipulating the expectations of society, which you know, is an interesting point, because effectively we have the CEO of our global monetary system, right? And what's he doing? He's exhibiting very similar behavior to public CEOs. What do? They speak positively until the ship is sunk. You know, that's the only thing they can do. If they start trying to manipulate expectations downwards, you know, it's over for them anyways. And I think it's kind of a similar incentive that he's dealing with. It's like, well, I gotta lie, because if I don't, what else am I gonna do?
Yeah. Well, there is one difference though. And that's, we haven't talked about my background, at least today, Eric, but, you know, I was a C-suite exec in a Fortune 500 company. And if I went on and I lied about something, there's very fine lines of guidance. You know, I'm going to get SEC fines. I'm going to get jailed. I'm going to get class action lawsuits. I'm going to get all those sort of things. By the way, I don't want to live in that world anymore. But the CEO of a Fortune 500 company that is untruthful, you know, he may find himself in front of a judge or a Senate hearing, or at a minimum, a class action lawsuit. We have no recourse. I mean, we as a society have no recourse when what they say they're going to accomplish doesn't get accomplished.
That's a great point. Yep. And that's the greatest tragedy of the entire system, is just how much damage is ultimately caused by that fact. And the fact that there is no recourse, and the fact that it's perpetually being done, and most people are unaware of it.
Yeah. Well, I know that you have to run, Eric. Do you, where can people find out about you? We'll put this in the show notes, of course, as well. And are you speaking somewhere soon?
Yeah, follow me on Twitter. It's my handle is my name, ERICYAKES, and check out the book if you want. And feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. And that's pretty much it. I'll probably be making an appearance at the Pacific Bitcoin Conference. It's going to be in LA in November. And other than that, yeah, just stay. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, probably too much.
Well, good. Well, hey, thank you so much for giving your time to spend with me today. Been a pleasure having you here. The book's outstanding. It's a must read, or as I said, for anybody that is in the Bitcoin space, anybody that you want an orange pill to bring into the Bitcoin space. It's an excellent choice as for a newbie, somebody you're trying to convert. So, show Eric some love, give his book a chance. You'll really like it. Yeah.
And thanks for having me on, Bob. And sincerely, this was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. I love the conversation. I love the format of everything. And this was really fun.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Eric. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation with Eric. Eric's clearly a bright and emerging mind in the Bitcoin space, and his book, The Seventh Property, is fantastic for anyone new to the Bitcoin space. But even experienced Bitcoiners like me will find little nooks and crannies in the rabbit hole. Eric is a must follow on Twitter, and you can find him at Eric Yakes, YAKES, and you can purchase his book on his website, yakes.io. Mind Your Business is brought to you by Barefoot Mining, and if you'd like to help support this show, donations to the Bitcoin wallet address listed in the show notes would be greatly appreciated. The music in the intro to this show is from a song called Flight by my friend and fellow Bitcoiner, Jordan Critz. Please check him out on Spotify, iTunes, or your favorite music platform. Finally, thanks for spending your time with me and Eric on Mind Your Business. This show is recorded on August 23rd, 2022, and nothing within it should be construed as legal, tax, or financial advice.